I'm guessing her and Jane worked on. Too cute. Thank you, guys. Tonight is my birthday. I am 33 years old, and I have the delightful opportunity to teach you guys 5 different chapters out of Leviticus. This is my 3rd study in Leviticus, and we started it last week. So on Wednesday last week, we got to look at the first 7 chapters of Leviticus. We got to see 5 different sacrifices, different offerings for different purposes. If you didn't get a chance to listen to that study, it's totally worth it, whether you listen to mine or just go read through them, just so you can get the differences between those 5 sacrifices. It really illuminates all the times in the Old Testament where a sacrifice is mentioned when you know what the different kinds are and what their purposes were. Then on Saturday, we got to look at the next 3 chapters. We got to see that first priesthood, Aaron and his sons. We saw their success when they were obedient, and then their crazy failure when they started to be presumptive in their worship and bring God something he did not ask for. Tonight, though, we're going to be looking into chapters 11 through 15. We have to remember, as we look at these chapters, as with all of Leviticus, that the book is a prescription for a certain people in a certain time. Nowhere in this book does it pretend to be rules for everyone forever. It is for them in that time. Now, there's a lot you can learn from it. There's a lot you can learn about God from it. But there is definitely not an onus on a modern-day Christian to pick up the Levitical law just as it was written and start enacting it on your life. No. Tonight, we're going to see the extremes they were asked to go to and the symbolism that was behind it, but also the wisdom that was behind it. You see, the things that God's asking for tonight from the Israelites is not just of a spiritual nature, but also a physical, practical nature. And that wisdom carries over to everyone in every culture at all times. And so as we sift through this and we see all that God intended for them, we can also see the wisdom that he may give to you tonight or to me. So let's begin with a menu. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 23 of Leviticus say this. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, these are the animals which you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. Among the animals, whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hooves and chewing the cud, that you may eat. Nevertheless, these you shall not eat among those that chew the cud or those that have cloven hooves. The camel, because it chews the cud but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. The rock hyrax, because it chews the cud but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. The hare, because it chews the cud but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. And the swine, though it divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, yet does not chew the cud, it is unclean to you. Their flesh you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. They are unclean to you. These you may eat of all that are in the water. Whatever in the water has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the rivers, that you may eat. But all in the seas or in the rivers that do not have fins and scales, all that move in the water or any living thing which is in the water, they are an abomination to you. They shall be an abomination to you. You shall not eat their flesh, but you shall regard their carcasses as an abomination. Whatever in the water does not have fins or scales, that shall be an abomination to you. And these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. The eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, the kite, and the falcon after its kind, every raven after its kind, the ostrich, the short-eared owl, the seagull, and the hawk after its kind, the little owl, the fisher owl, and the screech owl, the white owl, the jackdaw, and the carrion vulture, the stork, the heron after its kind, the hoopoe, and the bat. All flying insects that creep on all fours shall be an abomination to you. Yet these you may eat of every flying insect that creeps on all fours, those which have jointed legs above their feet with which to leap on the earth. These you may eat. The locust after its kind, the destroying locust after its kind, the cricket after its kind, and the grasshopper after its kind. But all other flying insects which have 4 feet shall be an abomination to you. Don't get tripped up on the 4-footed thing. That's just an old translation for it crawls. It doesn't stand up and walk on 2 legs. But here we see God divides up the animal kingdom essentially into 2 categories, and apparently based on health. If you really look at what all of these animals on the clean side, the unclean side have in common, there is, though, a symbolic structure taking shape in these opening verses that we're going to see echoed through the rest of our passage tonight. The scavengers of the animal kingdom, the cleanup crew of nature, the bottom feeders, they are all representative of death and decay. And the entire concept of clean and unclean is based on this precept that the Israelites need to be free from sin and death if they're going to approach a holy God. And so they cannot have these animals in their lives, not in a pet sort of way, not in an eating sort of way. There are only certain ones that they are allowed to eat. And there are so many health benefits that go along with this. So many of the diseases that they would not have been able to know about, they would not have been able to counteract at this point in history, they're going to be free from just by sticking to the menu that God prescribes. He is taking a lot of problems off the menu in doing this. Then we get into 24 through 47, and we're going to see a few more things about animals. 24 through 47 says this: "By these you shall become unclean. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them shall be unclean until evening. Whoever carries part of the carcass of any of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. The carcass of any animal which divides the foot but is not cloven hoofed or does not chew the cud is unclean to you. Everyone who touches it shall be unclean, and whatever goes on its paws among all kinds of animals that go on all fours, those are unclean to you. Whoever touches any such carcass shall be unclean until evening. Whoever carries any such carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. It is unclean to you. These also shall be unclean to you among the creeping things that creep on the earth: the mole, the mouse, the large lizard after its kind, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the sand reptile, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. These are unclean to you among all that creep. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be unclean until evening. Anything on which any of them falls when they are dead shall be unclean, whether it is any item of wood or clothing or skin or sack, whatever item it is in which any work is done, it must be put in water. It shall be unclean until evening. Then it shall be clean. Any earthen vessel into which any of them falls, you shall break, and whatever is in it shall be unclean. In such a vessel, any edible food upon which water falls becomes unclean, and any drink that may be drunk from it becomes unclean. And everything on which a part of any such carcass falls shall be unclean, whether it is an oven or cooking stove, it shall be broken down, for they are unclean and shall be unclean to you. Nevertheless, a spring or a cistern in which there is plenty of water shall be clean, and whatever touches any such carcass becomes unclean. And if a part of any such carcass falls on any planting seed which is to be sown, it remains clean. But if water is put on the seed, and if a part of any such carcass falls on it, it becomes unclean to you. And if any animal of which you may eat dies, he who touches its carcass shall be unclean until evening. He who eats of its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. He also who carries its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. And every creeping thing that creeps on the earth shall be an abomination. It shall not be eaten. Whatever crawls on its belly, whatever goes on all fours, or whatever has many feet among all creeping things that creep on the earth, these you shall not eat, for they are an abomination. You shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing that creeps, nor shall you make yourselves unclean with them, lest you be defiled by them. For I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore consecrate yourselves, and you shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourselves with any creeping thing that creeps on the earth, for I am the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. This is the law of the animals and the birds and every living creature that moves in the waters, and of every creature that creeps on the earth, to distinguish between the unclean and the clean, and between the animals that may be eaten and the animal that may not be eaten. Okay, so he goes a little bit further there, just a little bit. You can't even touch these animals if they're dead. If that's unclean. That's unclean. Even touching the clean animals, if they die of natural causes, that's unclean. And whatever they die on, that's also unclean. So you may as well just throw it away. But what it does not say, and you got to notice this, is that moving a carcass is in the way is not morally wrong. It doesn't say it's morally wrong. It doesn't say it's a crime. It doesn't prescribe a punishment for that. Instead, we're told to clean up, to take a bath, to wash our clothes, to be unclean until the end of the day. And this is sound advice. If you're living 3,400 years ago and you don't know the cause of death of some animal, you don't have scientifically derived disinfectants, yeah, you should definitely take precautions. You should absolutely assume the worst and prepare for the worst, and then pray for, hope for the best. At some point, if something dies on something important, like an oven, he says, don't even take a chance. Break down the oven. Now, he goes this far, and you'll notice there's two kinds of language in this passage, and we'll see one of each as we go through all these following chapters. He says sometimes that it's just unclean, and sometimes he says it's abominable. And you can kind of sense the difference in severity. That unclean is something that just has oh, you slipped, or oh, you didn't do it just the right way, so here's the prescription, here's the fix. And usually it's something relatively minor. And sometimes he says something's abominable. And these are not things you can oops into. These are things you have to choose to do. And when you do them, then you have directly chosen to go against what God has commanded. You've gone against what God has told you is best for you. And on top of that, you've done something that identifies yourself with the people of the world. We'll see that a few times in these passages tonight and many more times in the rest of Leviticus, that a lot of the things that God says are abominable are the things that were completely normal in the cultures that surround Israel. And God says, I don't want you to be anything like that. I don't want you to look like the world. I want you to look different. And so we see that that is the motivation many of the times in these different prescriptions, these different rules that God makes. Now we look at our shortest chapter tonight, chapter 12. We're going to look at childbirth. Chapter 12 says this, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, If a woman has conceived and borne a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. As in the days of her customary impurity, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. She shall then continue in the blood of her purification 33 days. She shall not touch any hallowed thing, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purification are fulfilled. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as in her customary impurity, and she shall continue in the blood of her purification 66 days. When the days of her purification are fulfilled, whether for a son or a daughter, she shall bring to the priest a lamb of the first year as a burnt offering, that's an offering of consecration, and a young pigeon or turtle dove as a sin offering, that's something you would do to become clean again, to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Then he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her, and she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who has borne a male or a female. And if she is not able to bring a lamb, then she may bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, one as a burnt offering and the other as a sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement for her, and she will be clean. We saw that when Jesus' earthly parents brought an offering on the end of Mary's impurity, that it wasn't the lamb. It was the offering of those that had less. It was the offering of those that did not have great means. And so he was born into one of these families that had less. And I think it's beautiful as you go through all of this that God sets up the symbolic, he sets up the grandiose, he sets up the big and the intended, and then he says, but I get that that's not everyone. Not everyone can take a lamb and give it to me every time. Not everyone can afford to do the full measure, the thing that is the picture I'm looking for. And so he always makes provision at the ends of these chapters for, but if you can't do that, just do this. Just complete the symbology, even though it's not exactly what I was hoping for. And he accepts it. He doesn't say, and you are lesser. He doesn't say, and you slightly disappoint me. He just says, you know what? If you don't have all that, bring me what you have. Bring me what you have. We'll see that as we get into the lepers too. But I want you to understand that there's a reverence here for life. There's a reverence for anything that represents life. And I know that's strange because the word unclean keeps getting used over and over. We can start to attach a negative or a sinful connotation to the thing that made you unclean. But being unclean is meant to be symbolic of sin. It's not necessarily coming from sin every time. It's not always starting with sin and then you're unclean. It's not how it always works. And we'll see that as we keep going. There are things you have no control over that are going to make you unclean. And it can't be sin because it's not born from your intentions. It's not born from action you had control over in the first place. But you do live in a sinful world. We all do. And so life represented in blood and all the different things we're going to see tonight that represent sin, they are a fact of our existence. They are part of our human nature more often than not, and we cannot escape them even if we are not sinning as these things come to be. But there's also some wisdom here. There's reverence for the mother too, that even though she was being considered unclean, and we might think of that as, a synonym for sinful, it's not in this case. Look at what's happening. It says after a certain amount of time, then you're going to take your son to be circumcised, but then there's even more time. And really, while you're unclean, you get to forgo social obligations. You get to just stay home and push aside all the normal weekly stuff that you would otherwise have to do. And so there's essentially maternity leave written into this passage, and double if you have a girl. I think that's interesting that you would get double the time at home, double the time bonding over what historically, socially, culturally was looked on as a lesser child. And I think that's kind of cool that in the very first days, you get more time for the family to connect with a daughter. And then you also see that there can't be an assumption of sin. There can't be some sort of wrongness surrounding childbirth, because what happens on the 8th day? You put a little pause on the uncleanness and you go show up for the circumcision, and then you go back to your uncleanness. And if it really was a sin problem or some sort of moral wrongness in bearing a child, that wouldn't be. You couldn't possibly just go to the tabernacle with a pause on your uncleanness and then go back to it. That wouldn't work. And so there's definitely symbology going on here, but not something where someone did something wrong. No. Childbirth is too beautiful in the presentation of life into the world. The new person that has arrived. And the mother needs to be given that respect and reverence and time off. And that's really what I see here in chapter 12. But there is still that reverence for blood. We're going to see that over and over and over again, that blood is representative of the life of what it came from. And that there are other things we're about to get into that are a little less clean, a little less pleasant even than blood. And they are going to represent the opposite. They're going to represent death. They're going to represent that which takes and destroys life. And they are just as serious, and you have to treat them just as serious, but they are not celebrated. No. You don't just get time off. You get quarantine. All right, so let's look into chapter 13. Chapter 13, verses 1 through 28. This is kind of leprosy 101. We're not going to leave leprosy for a while, I'm sorry to say. It gets 2 whole chapters tonight. So let's start us off with verses 1 through 28 of chapter 13. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a man has on the skin of his body a swelling, a scab, or a bright spot, and it becomes on the skin of his body like a leprous sore, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons, the priests. The priest shall examine the sore on the skin of the body, and if the hair on the sore has turned white, and the sore appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a leprous sore. Then the priest shall examine him and pronounce him unclean. But if the bright spot is white on the skin of his body and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and its hair has not turned white, then the priest shall isolate the one who has the sore 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the seventh day, and indeed, if the sore appears to be as it was, and the sore has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall isolate him another 7 days. Then the priest shall examine him again on the seventh day, and indeed, if the sore has faded, or the sore has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only a scab, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the scab should at all spread over the skin after he has been seen by the priest for his cleansing, he shall be seen by the priest again. And if the priest sees that the scab has indeed spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy. When the leprous sore is on a person, then he shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall examine him. And indeed, if the swelling on the skin is white, and it has turned the hair white, and there is a spot of raw flesh in the swelling, it is an old leprosy on the skin of his body. The priest shall pronounce him unclean, and shall not isolate him, for he is unclean. And if the leprosy breaks out all over the skin, and the leprosy covers all the skin of the one who has the sore from his head to his foot, wherever the priest looks, then the priest shall consider. And indeed, if the leprosy has covered all his body, he shall pronounce him clean who has the sore. It has all turned white. That's the key there, if you're wondering why that's so confusing. It's the fact that it's new skin over the top of it. It's turned white. He is clean, it says. Verse 14, but when raw flesh appears on him, he shall be unclean. And the priest shall examine the raw flesh and pronounce him unclean. For the raw flesh is unclean, it is leprosy. Or if the raw flesh changes and turns white again, he shall come to the priest, and the priest shall examine him. And indeed, if the sore has turned white, then the priest shall pronounce him clean, who has the sore. He is clean. If the body develops a boil in the skin, and it is healed, and in the place of the boil there comes a white swelling or a bright spot, reddish white, then it shall be shown to the priest. And if, when the priest sees it, it indeed appears deeper than the skin, and its hair has turned white, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous sore, which has broken out of the boil. But if the priest examines it, and indeed there are no white hairs in it, and it is not deeper than the skin, but has faded, then the priest shall isolate him 7 days. And if it should at all spread over the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous sore. But if the bright spot stays in one place and has not spread, it is the scar of the boil, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. We're almost done. Just verse 28 we're going to get to. Or if the body receives a burn on its skin by fire, and the raw flesh of the burn becomes a bright spot, reddish, white, or white, then the priest shall examine it. And indeed, if the hair of the bright spot has turned white, and it appears deeper than the skin, it is leprosy broken out in the burn. Therefore, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous sore. But if the priest examines it, and indeed there is no white hairs in the bright spot, and it is not deeper than the skin, but has faded, then the priest shall isolate him 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the seventh day. And if it has at all spread over the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous sore. You could almost make this a poem. But if the bright spot stays in one place and has not spread on the skin, but has faded, it is a swelling from the burn. The priest shall pronounce him clean, for it is the scar from the burn. Oh, isn't that good reading? Okay, so the first thing to note here, and maybe you've already picked it up because the Bible does not contradict itself, is that the modern day disease known as leprosy caused by Mycobacterium leprae is not the only thing meant when the New King James translates the old Hebrew words nega sarath as a leprous sore. It's not only referring to leprosy as we know it today. Leprosy is a real thing. Leprosy is talked about in the Bible for real, sometimes even specifically in the New Testament. But generally speaking in the Old Testament, it's not always just one disease. They didn't know one disease from the other, by and large. So their word here is literally just the term irritating sore. That's it. A leprous sore is not a word that's specific to a bacteria, specific to a fungi. It's specific to the feeling. That's it. That's all it means. It's the feeling, an irritating sore. Okay, some kind of lesion, some kind of opening or discoloration or change of your skin that bothers you. That's as specific as we're really getting. And that's why there's so much written here, and still some we haven't read yet, about this. It's because God is offering prescriptive advice for the navigation of a myriad of issues. There's all kinds of things that may or may not be transmittable, and that's the part that makes those sections where he says, it is this, but don't isolate him. Why does he say that? Well, because God actually knows if it meets those criteria, then it's not even transmittable. Don't even worry about it. He can just go about his business. I mean, he's ceremonially unclean, but no one's going to catch it from him. And then there's other times where he says, no, you got to isolate. Or, hey, you know what? At this stage in the infection, by visual cues alone, you could not possibly tell if it's transmittable. So he's going to isolate a week and come back. And then you'll check it again. And based on what happens, then you'll know if it's transmittable. God is giving them such wisdom so far ahead of their time in history. It's really amazing. And that's why he focuses on skin diseases. God could basically stop and explain everything about bacteria. He could totally do that, but it wouldn't help them. They don't have any petri dishes. They don't have any microscopes. It would just be so much head knowledge. But the things he does explain are the things that a priest could just look at you and actually take action on. He could actually diagnose. These are things you can tell from the outside with no equipment. And so that's what God spends the time on. He says, here's what you can solve. Here's what you can avoid. On top of that, these are the things that were in their part of the world afflicting many. So these are the things that bothered them, that God could actually hand them a manual one day and it would help them. So he does. But beyond that, we're also dealing with things that symbolically represent death and decay, which God says should have no part in the worship at the tabernacle. And so he says, if any of these things are afflicting you, you're unclean. Ceremonially unclean. And so he's going to keep going. We're going to keep going. We're going to look at verses 29 through 46, and we're going to see there are other things that he is tackling, and by description alone, you can tell these are not leprosy by what that word means today. Not all of them. A lot of them are not even close. They're caused by completely different things. But he's still going to cover them, and based on the vagueness of Hebrew, it's still going to get called leprosy. And remember, they're not lying. The Bible's not misleading you. It's just that in Hebrew, that word never meant specifically one disease only. It's just by a weird fluke of translation that it kind of looks that way. So look at verses 29 through 46 now. If a man or woman has a sore on the head or the beard, then the priest shall examine the sore, and indeed, if it appears deeper than the skin, and there is in it thin yellow hair, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a scaly leprosy of the head or beard. But if the priest examines the scaly sore, and indeed it does not appear deeper than the skin, and there is no black hair in it, then the priest shall isolate the one who has the scale 7 days. And on the 7th day, the priest shall examine the sore, and indeed, if the scale has not spread, and there is no yellow hair in it, and the scale does not appear deeper than the skin, he shall shave himself, but the scale he shall not shave. And the priest shall isolate the one who has the scale another 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall examine the scale. And indeed, if the scale has not spread over the skin and does not appear deeper than the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. He shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the scale should at all spread over the skin after his cleansing, then the priest shall examine him. And indeed, if the scale has spread over the skin, the priest need not seek for yellow hair. He is unclean. But if the scale appears to be at a standstill and there is black hair grown up in it, the scale has healed. He is clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. If a man or a woman has bright spots on the skin of the body, specifically white, bright spots, then the priest shall look, and indeed, if the bright spots on the skin of the body are dull white, it is a white spot that grows on the skin. He is clean. Just a normal spot on the skin. Verse 40, as for the man whose hair has fallen from his head, he is bald, but he is clean. He whose hair has fallen from his forehead he is bald on the forehead, but he is clean. And if there is on the bald head or bald forehead a reddish-white sore, it is leprosy breaking out on his bald head or his bald forehead. Then the priest shall examine it, and indeed, if the swelling of the sore is reddish-white on his bald head or on his bald forehead, as the appearance of leprosy on the skin of the body, he is a leprous man. He is unclean. The priest shall surely pronounce him unclean. His sore is on his head. Now, the leper on whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn, and his head bare, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. He shall be unclean. All the days he has the sore, he shall be unclean. He is unclean, and he shall dwell alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. That image of someone shouting, unclean, unclean, I think that's what usually gets lodged in our heads as we read through passages like this. It's something that's stuck with us. It's stuck with pop culture. But I would like to remember this section for what it would have accomplished if the Israelites followed this practically. These would have served as medically reliable directives, and it would have prevented the spread of serious illness. God gave his people visual cues and wait times that would take thousands of years to catch on in the wider world. And we do not need to see the removal of an Israelite from the whole society as something God prescribes. He says, go and live outside the camp. And what does he say? He has all these prescriptive guidelines of how to come back in, how to rejoin society. And remember that this isn't only for the disease that we call leprosy, which at their point in history would have required a miracle to heal. It was also for lesser diseases, lesser transmittable skin illnesses. So there were lots of cases where someone could have one of these less than what we call leprosy illnesses, and they would have just been healed by the natural process of time. And so they would not be stuck outside of camp for the rest of their life. Really, that idea of ostracize someone and throw them out and never let them back in comes from the misunderstanding about which diseases we're talking about, but also from the fear of future generations. You see, God doesn't have that fear. He instead says, do what's safe, and when they're healed, bring them back in. Later generations would look on diseases they didn't know how to fix and just say, you're done. We're never talking to you again. Get out. But really, this call here, we see at the last paragraph, to yell out unclean, to cover your mouth, that was just so you could get from the tabernacle, where you had just been inspected, out to where you were going to quarantine. It's not meant to be a way of life that forevermore you would always be a leper. But rather that you would just protect the people around you. As you know now, you've been inspected. It's kind of like you went to the doctor and he told you, yep, you have a serious illness and it's highly transmittable. You wouldn't then go see your friends and tell them, yeah, I'm really sick. Everyone who's near me can catch it. No, you would go straight from the doctor to quarantine, maybe by the, pharmacy first if he gave you something. But you wouldn't just go around spreading it, telling everyone you're sick. No. You would head straight out of there to where you could be alone, keep everyone else safe as best you could, and then you go get checked out again later. Checked out after it starts to clear up. So all of this is wisdom. All of this makes total sense. We're going to keep going, though. We're going to start reading about garments, fabrics. So we're going to finish up chapter 13. So start out in verse 47. Also, if a garment has a leprous plague in it, whether it is a woolen garment or a linen garment, whether it is in the warp or the woof of the linen or wool, whether in leather or in anything made of leather. If you're not familiar with woof, I think we have a different word for it now, I forget, but the different directions of the threads in a woven garment. So you've got one direction is the warp, one's the woof. I like that word. Verse 49. And if the plague is greenish or reddish in the garment or in the leather, whether in the warp or in the woof or in anything made of leather, it is a leprous plague and shall be shown to the priest. The priest shall examine the plague and isolate that which has the plague 7 days. And he shall examine the plague on the seventh day. And if the plague has spread in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, in the leather or in anything made of leather, the plague is an active leprosy. Don't you just love that terminology that we feel like we invented hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later? that the infection is active. The bacteria or the mold or the fungus is active. And yet that's how God talks about it all the way back here in Leviticus. It's 3,400 years old. It's pretty cool. Sorry, finish verse 41. 51. It is unclean. 52. He shall therefore burn that garment in which is the plague, whether warp or woof, in wool or in linen, or anything of leather, for it is an active leprosy. The garment shall be burned in the fire. But if the priest examines it, and indeed the plague has not spread in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, or in anything made of leather, then the priest shall command that they wash the thing in which is the plague, and he shall isolate it another 7 days. Then the priest shall examine the plague after it has been washed. And indeed, if the plague has not changed or changed its color, though the plague has not spread, it is unclean, and you shall burn it in the fire. It continues eating away, whether the damage is outside or inside. If the priest examines it, and indeed the plague has faded after washing it, then he shall tear it out of the garment, whether out of the warp or out of the woof or out of the leather. But if it appears again in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, or in anything made of leather, it is a spreading plague. You shall burn it with fire, that in which is the plague. And if you wash the garment, either in the warp or the woof, or whatever is made of leather, if the plague has disappeared from it, then it shall be washed a second time and shall be clean. This is the law of the leprous plague in a garment of wool or linen, either in the warp or the woof, or in anything made of leather, to pronounce it clean or to pronounce it unclean. Moldy fabric and leather is unclean. And there's symbolic uncleanness here. The sin and the death is represented in the decay that is caused by what's described here. What's described here? Not leprosy. No. This is mold. This is fungus. These are little things, some of them very microscopic, all stacking up into a pile you can see, and they are eating away at what that garment is made out of. And it says as much, and that is so impressive to me, that for thousands of years, the action of microbes was being described in Leviticus, and probably no one even understood until just a little while ago what it was that God was really talking about. And yet, he knows, so he says it, and he just gives them commands. Hey, if you see this, here's what's happening. And here's the right action to take. Some can be washed clean, and he tells you how to know if that's the case, but some would have to be burned in the fire. And again, we see God's requiring something for a spiritual purpose, but it has this practical benefit as well. At the end of chapter 14, we revisit molds and fungi. We're going to talk about the dangers that they present, but it's the same ones here as we'll get to later at the end of 14. So we'll just mention it once. So let's start chapter 14. This is the part that tells you about the cleansing of a leper and what to do when he's lost all his symptoms and he's ready to be called clean again. And so we know it happens because, well, he gives you the prescription for what to do when it happens. Verse 1 through 32 of chapter 14. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "This shall be the law of the leper for the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall examine him. And indeed, if the leprosy is healed in the leper, then the priest shall command to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 living and clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet, and hyssop. And the priest shall command that one of the birds be killed in an earthen vessel over running water. As for the living bird, he shall take it, the cedar wood, and the scarlet, and the hyssop, and dip them and the living bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the running water. And he shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed from the leprosy, and shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the living bird loose in the open field. He who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes, shave off all his hair, and wash himself in water, that he may be clean. After that, he shall come into the camp, and shall stay outside his tent 7 days. But on the 7th day he shall shave all the hair off his head, and his beard, and his eyebrows, all his hair he shall shave off. He shall wash his clothes and wash his body in water, and he shall be clean. And on the 8th day he shall take 2 male lambs without blemish, 1 ewe lamb of the first year without blemish, 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil as a grain offering, and 1 log, it's about 10 ounces, as 1 log of oil. Verse 11, then the priest who makes him clean shall present the man who is to be made clean, and those things before the Lord at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And the priest shall take 1 male lamb and offer it as a trespass offering, and the log of oil, and wave them as a wave offering before the Lord. Then he shall kill the lamb in the place where he kills the sin offering and the burnt offering in a holy place. For as the sin offering is the priest's, so is the trespass offering. It is most holy. The priest shall take some of the blood of the trespass offering, and the priest shall put it on the tip of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. And the priest shall take some of the log of oil and pour it into the palm of his own left hand. Then the priest shall dip his right finger in the oil that is on his left hand, and shall sprinkle some of the oil with his finger 7 times before the Lord. And of the rest of the oil in his hand, the priest shall put some on the tip of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, on the blood of the trespass offering. So we have layers there of blood first, then oil. The rest of the oil that is in the priest's hand shall be put on the head of him who is to be cleansed, of him, read that twice. So the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord. Then the priest shall offer the sin offering and make atonement for him who is to be cleansed from his uncleanness. Afterward he shall kill the burnt offering, and the priest shall offer the burnt offering and the grain offering on the altar. So the priest shall make atonement for him, and he shall be clean. But if he is poor and cannot afford it, then he shall take 1 male lamb as a trespass offering to be waved, to make atonement for him, 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil as a grain offering, a log of oil, and 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, such as he is able to afford. That's a key phrase. One shall be a sin offering and the other a burnt offering. He shall bring them to the priest on the 8th day for his cleansing, to the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord. And the priest shall take the lamb of the trespass offering and the log of oil, and the priest shall wave them as a wave offering before the Lord. Then he shall kill the lamb of the trespass offering, and the priest shall take some of the blood of the trespass offering and put it on the tip of the right ear on him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. And the priest shall pour some of the oil into the palm of his own left hand, and then the priest shall sprinkle with his right finger some of the oil that is in his left hand 7 times before the Lord. And the priest shall put some of the oil that is in his hand on the tip of his right ear and of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, on the place of the blood of the trespass offering. The rest of the oil that is in the priest's hand, he shall put on the head of him who is to be cleansed, to make atonement for him before the Lord. And he shall offer 1 of the turtle doves or young pigeons, such as he can afford, such as he is able to afford, the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, with the grain offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him who is to be cleansed before the Lord. This is the law for one who had a leper sore, who cannot afford the usual cleansing. Whew. Okay, a little bit of repetition there, but that's because he wants to make sure you understand that certain things are allowed to change based on what you can afford, but none of the rest. The whole ritual is the same, whether you can afford much or little. And I think that's an important distinction to make. He does it in great detail, but it's an important distinction that doesn't matter what you can bring. It matters that you're healed and that you're reconsecrating yourself to be part of the congregation who worships a holy God. I think it's really fitting, too, that the prior offerings that this one most reflects, that this one most resembles, is the one that was asked of Aaron and his sons when they joined the priesthood. You see, this person who was put outside the camp, who was in quarantine, is now seeking to rejoin the congregation, just as the priests were joining the priesthood. And so this act of putting both the blood and the oil on their ear, their thumb, their toe, essentially consecrating all of them, at least symbolically. It was something that says, here's what you're aiming for. You're aiming for reunification. You're aiming to join something. In their case, rejoin something. Also, they're only required to bring what they can afford. And we see that in greater detail here than in other places. It gets a little mention in a few of the other places. But I think that's important too, because as you get quarantined, you may not get to continue your livelihood. Whatever your work is, whatever your job is, may have to be put on hold while you're waiting out your illness. Whether your illness was something so communicable you couldn't do your job because you risked spreading it to others, or your job was very physical and your illness kept you from exerting yourself physically, whatever the reason, you may be poorer now at the end of your leprosy, at the end of your sickened state, than you were at the start. And there's just a recognition of that from God that that's just real life. That's just the way it actually is, and he's making a way to get through that. Then we get into buildings in the rest of chapter 14. Here we go, verses 33 through 57. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when you have come into the land of Canaan, which I give you as a possession, and I put the leprous plague in a house in the land of your possession, and he who owns the house comes and tells the priest, saying, it seems to me that there is some plague in the house. Then the priest shall command that they empty the house before the priest goes in to examine the plague, that all that is in the house may not be made unclean. And afterward the priest shall go in to examine the house, and he shall examine the plague. And indeed, if the plague is on the walls of the house with ingrained streaks, greenish or reddish, which appear to be deep in the wall, then the priest shall go out of the house to the door of the house and shut up the house 7 days. And the priest shall come again on the seventh day and look. And indeed, if the plague is spread on the walls of the house, then the priest shall command that they take away the stones in which is the plague, and they shall cast them into an unclean place outside the city. And he shall cause the house to be scraped inside all around, and the dust that they scrape off they shall pour out in an unclean place outside the city. Then they shall take other stones and put them in the place of those stones, and he shall take other mortar and plaster the house. Now, if the plague comes back and breaks out in the house after he has taken away the stones, after he has scraped the house, and after it is plastered, then the priest shall come and look. And indeed, if the plague is spread in the house, it is an act of leprosy in the house. It is unclean. And he shall break down the house, its stones, its timbers, and all the plaster of the house. And he shall carry them outside the city to an unclean place. Moreover, he who goes into the house at all while it is shut up shall be unclean until evening. And he who lies down in the house shall wash his clothes, and he who eats in the house shall wash his clothes. But if the priest comes in and examines it, and indeed the plague has not spread in the house after the house was plastered, then the priest shall pronounce the house clean, because the plague is healed. And he shall take to cleanse the house 2 birds, cedar, wood, scarlet, and hyssop. You know what's coming. Then he shall kill one of the birds in an earthen vessel over running water, and he shall take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the scarlet, and the living bird, and dip them in the blood of the slain bird and in the running water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. And he shall cleanse the house with the blood of the bird and the running water and the living bird with the cedar wood and the hyssop and the scarlet. Then he shall let the living bird loose outside the city in the open field and make atonement for the house. It shall be clean. This is the law for any leprous sore and scale, for the leprosy of a garment and of a house, for a swelling and a scab and a bright spot, to teach when it is unclean and when it is clean. This is the law of leprosy. Okay, we're done with leprosy. I hope you're as excited as I am to go on to discharges in the next chapter. So earlier in chapter 13, we actually covered fabrics and leathers, which would have covered their current dwellings because they lived in tents. While they were in the wilderness where this was being written, they all lived in tents. And so when you talk about fabric and leather, you're covering not just clothing, not just, grain sacks or something, like you're covering their tents. But God looks forward to the future as he writes this, as he tells Moses and Aaron, and he says, in a house someday down the road that you might live in, there could be an infestation of mold, of fungus, and again, it's translated as leprosy. But that's not really what we're talking about. You can't get mycobacteria, infesting your walls, turning it red or green. That's not realistic. What he's talking about is molds and fungi. So if those are infesting your house, amazing advice, way ahead of its time. Break out the stones where it is, get them out of your house. Put in brand new ones and see if you got it all. If you didn't get it all, sorry, you only got one chance at this. So you really had to make sure you got all those stones out, because if it came back, it's down with the house. We're done. Knock that thing down to its foundation. But if you can get it out, great, then you've got your house back. And this, to me, speaks not just of sin and sin nature. This, to me, speaks of the thing that leads to it. This speaks of temptation. You have to remove temptations if you really want to be free from all of their effects. I have found that to be the case in my life. I think you could probably look back on your own history and you could nod your head and go, yeah, you're right. That a temptation left lying around, no matter how great we think of ourselves, no matter how noble and well grown up we are as Christians, a temptation left right in front of us is something that will have an effect. Even if we don't cave to that temptation, it still steals time. It steals place in our thoughts. But if you do that hard work of just getting rid of the temptation, physically removing it from your life, that's it. It has no more hold over you. You can go years and years and years without ever thinking about it ever again, because it's gone. And that's what he says to do here. Get rid of it. Remove it. Now, chapter 15, last one for tonight. We're going to look at some lesser discharges and then some normal, everyday life type discharges. And we're going to see that they are rather different, and yet they fall in order because they kind of, the first set straddles the line between what we saw from leprosy and what we're going to see at the very end of chapter 15. So the first set here is just those first 15 verses in chapter 15. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when any man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. And this shall be his uncleanness in regard to his discharge. Whether his body runs with his discharge or his body is stopped up by his discharge, it is his uncleanness. Every bed is unclean on which he who has the discharge lies, and everything on which he sits shall be unclean. And whoever touches his bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. He who sits on anything on which he who has the discharge sat shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. And he who touches the body of him who has the discharge shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. If he who has the discharge spits on him who is clean, then he shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Any saddle on which he who has the discharge rides shall be unclean. Whoever touches anything that was under him shall be unclean until evening. He who carries any of those things shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. And whomever the one who has the discharge touches and has not rinsed his hands in water, he shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. The vessel of the vessel of earth that he who has the discharge touches shall be broken, and every vessel of wood shall be rinsed in water. And then he who has a discharge, and when he who has a discharge is cleansed of his discharge, then he shall count for himself 7 days for his cleansing, wash his clothes, and bathe his body in running water. Then he shall be clean. On the 8th day he shall take for himself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, and come before the Lord to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and give them to the priest. And the priest shall offer them, the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord because of his discharge. Just real quick here, the word discharge is intentionally vague in the Hebrew, and you can use it for all sorts of things. Everything from a runny nose to gonorrhea. It's representative of any kind of fluid that would leave your body due to illness. And really, this is amazing wisdom for thousands of years ago. To avoid touching anything the sick person has touched, to avoid touching anything that carries that infective agent, that's amazing wisdom. And it even goes so far as to say you got to wash if you do. And really, that's what tells you this isn't all about a moral guideline. This isn't about sin, because the prescription for those who cross the line, not the sick person, but those who cross the line, is to wash and get clean. And that's how they're made clean, in the very real sense. To use water to scrub yourself to be clean in the physical sense was, in this one instance, how you became clean in the spiritual sense. And so it really does tell us something about our own society, that when you spend prolonged time with someone with sin in their life, with death reigning in their life, it's going to have an effect on you. And that's not to say you shouldn't reach out to them, but rather be on your guard. And when you are done, wash. When you are spending time with someone who is lost and you are reaching out to them, make sure you are refreshed when you leave. Make sure you wash your heart. Go before the Lord. Make sure you are not being affected by the person you're trying to minister to. It's not saying don't do it. It's saying make sure you are not falling prey to what the world has to offer as you try and bring the love and the truth of God into the world. Last thing here, and this is probably one of the most important parts in the whole thing. I hate to feel like I'm rushing it, but we've spent so much time in these passages so far. But in these last verses, 16 through 33, we're going to see lots of different things that all have a common thread. So start with me in verse 16. If any man has an emission of semen, then he shall wash all his body in water and be unclean until evening. And any garment and any leather on which there is semen, it shall be washed with water and be unclean until evening. Also, when a woman lies with a man and there is an emission of semen, they shall bathe in water and be unclean until evening. If a woman has a discharge, and the discharge from her body is blood, she shall be set apart 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Everything that she lies on during her impurity shall be unclean. Also, everything that she sits on shall be unclean. Whoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. And whoever touches anything that she sat on shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. If anything is on her bed or on anything on which she sits, when he touches it, he shall be unclean until evening. And if any man lies with her at all, so that her impurity is on him, he shall be unclean 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, other than at the time of her customary impurity, or if it runs beyond her usual time of impurity, all the days of her unclean discharge shall be as the days of her customary impurity. Every bed on which she lies all the days of her discharge shall be to her as the bed of her impurity, and whatever she sits on shall be unclean as the uncleanness of her impurity. Whoever touches those things shall be unclean. He shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. But if she is cleansed of her discharge, then she shall count for herself 7 days, and after that she shall be clean. And on the 8th day she shall take for herself 2 turtle doves and 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Then the priest shall offer the one as a sin offering. Remember, that's to become ritually clean again. And the other as a burnt offering. That's to be consecrated to the Lord and his purposes, to his worship and his praise. And the priest shall make atonement for her before the Lord for the discharge of her uncleanness. Thus you shall separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness. This is referring back to all the chapters we've read. Lest they die in their uncleanness when they defile my tabernacle that is among them. This is the law for one who has a discharge, and for him who emits semen and is unclean thereby, and for her who is indisposed because of her customary impurity, and for one who has a discharge, either man or woman, or for him who lies with her who is unclean. Now, there is a lot of different things that are touched on here in this last little passage, but I want to be clear about one thing that might be kind of a wrong takeaway. I want to set it straight. Sex within marriage should never carry a negative connotation. But we see here a command to bathe and to wait a day before becoming clean again with, and this is key, no sacrifice and no offering required. So sex within marriage between a man and a woman should not be looked down upon. No. But the symbolism of life and of death does encompass man's seed. And so too, we cannot ignore the blood that is lost every month during menstruation. Just as childbirth, we saw prior chapter 12, is sacred, and it had prescriptions, it had rules. So too do those things that have the power to bring new life into the world. And God gave us a multifaceted blessing when he gave us bodies that are capable of sex and reproduction. In our bodies, we have the power to bring new life into the world, to bring someone whose soul God has created. We also have the power to draw close to our spouse, closer to them than any human on earth, and to experience that closeness and oneness with them that can only be rivaled by our relationship with Jesus. And this is why all these things in chapters 11 through 15 are here, and they're being dealt with the way they're being dealt with. God wants his people to have no detractors, no distractors, and no infectors when they gather with the congregation at the tent of meeting. I pray that when we gather here in person, or we gather at a home fellowship in person, that we're practicing that same consecrated lifestyle, that we leave our detractors, our distractors, and our infectors out of the gathering. That when we gather, we'd be wholly devoted to the worship of our Lord and our Savior, ready to be maybe convicted, but ready to have our lives changed as we approach him once more, our holy, holy God. Now, there are some large differences. Even though I like to draw some similarities between these two, there are some very large differences between the Levitical system that they are prescribing here and our relationship with Jesus. We do not need to be clean before we approach him. No. He says, come as you are. He's the one who's going to clean us up. We do not need to be clean before we ask others for help. There is no sign out front that says, make sure you leave your sin in the car before you open the door to the church. No. If you need help, come straight in. We do not need to be clean before we gather. Rather, we should have the understanding that the gathering has a reason behind it, that we're meaning to worship God. We're meaning to draw attention to him when we gather. But all through this, you can see that when someone is sick, they are not sent out at the mere rumor of their sickness. They are not sent out at just the idea they might be sick, but rather they're first drawn in and given the prescription. They're first drawn in and seen by the priest face to face before anything else gets done. Before any other thing might happen, they have to go see the priest. They have to do what God prescribes. And that, I think, is wisdom we can carry over to today. That when you have a problem in your life, something that may cause you shame, that may make you think, I can't go back to church, that the first thing that you should do if you're mirroring the Levitical structure and trying to find the wisdom there and apply it to church today is talk to a pastor. The first thing, get prayer. Find what the prescription that God may have for you is. With that, let's pray. Lord, we thank you for all that you've written in Scripture, even if sometimes we look on it and we wonder, why? Why did we have to have all that detail? Or why did he have to repeat himself like that? Lord, you have put so much wisdom in this that as we pore over it, those questions are answered. Lord, you wanted to reveal a plan for your people at that point in history to not just survive, but thrive. To not just make it, but make it to the promised land with a great nation in tow. And we see that today is true for us. You did not just write the 4 Gospels and say, here's how you're saved, have a nice day. Lord, you have written the whole body of Scripture for our whole selves to just absorb and grow from it. There isn't just one thing in your word, just the seed and that's it, but rather the seed of the gospel there to save us, and then all the things we need after that, the water and the fertilizer and everything we need to remain healthy. And so we thank you, Lord, that there is all these many types of scripture and that we can look into them and always see your heart behind it and see your great plan at work. I ask that you would apply that wisdom to our hearts tonight, that we would have that relationship with you that is closer than with any human. And if you're out there tonight and you're watching this and you're going, why would he study Leviticus? It's because I love my God, and I know that everything he writes has meaning in it. Everything he writes is for my good, for my growth. And if you want to have that relationship with him, but you don't have it yet, you want to join his family, be his child, and get to read his word and know that he wrote it for you too, then you can join his family right now. The Bible says that Jesus died on the cross to make that possible. He was the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. That he wants you to be in his family. He wants you to be in his kingdom. He wants you to be in heaven with him forever. So if you want to do that right now, just repeat these words. Express your faith in him, to him. Pray this after me. Dear Jesus, thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for dying in my place. Please forgive me. Take my sins away. Make me clean. Make me pure. Make me holy like you. And fill me with your Holy Spirit. Use it to guide me, to show me how to live for you, how to be one of your kids. And we ask, Lord, that you would gather all of us to your kingdom, so that even if we die, we are going to be in heaven with you forever. We ask this in your name, Jesus. Amen. If you prayed that prayer tonight, that one at the end where you said, Jesus, save me, we want to know. We want to hear from you. So call us. The number should be on screen, or else you can find it on our website. You can hear it at the end of the broadcast, and get in contact with us. We want to answer any questions you have, pray with you, get you a Bible, whatever it is you need to start this walk with Jesus. But in any case, I think for all of us, it'd be great to have one last song where we can lift up God's great name.